Welcome to the Social Justice War Room, the podcast where we talk about social justice in fiction, reality, and everything in between. My guest today is a cartoonist, a teacher, a tabletop gamer, a dungeon master, and many other things. He does the comic Games People Play, which you can describe as either a political comic about gaming or a gaming comic about politics. Please welcome Israel Reyes. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm mostly fine. Well, all things considered.
Yes, all things considered, there's a lot going on. So, would you say your comic is a gaming comic about politics or a political comic about gaming?
Well, originally it started specifically as a gaming comic. However, well, there's only so much you can say about tabletop RPGs. Well, basically the same 20 discussions have been repeating themselves for over 50 years.
Possibly. I mean, has it at least changed a bit since a lot of it's being done via Zoom now?
So yeah, basically I started including the comic every topic that interests me at the moment, or anything I had something to comment about.
Yeah. So a lot of it has gone into video games as well recently. Is that also a longtime interest of yours?
Oh yes, I've been acquainted to video games since about age 4.
Uh, when would your first game be? That was around the same age I got into it.
My first video game, if I remember right, it was the original Mario Bros for the Atari 2600.
Yeah, mine was a little later, the original Super Mario Bros. For NES. But and since then, this is where a lot of the politics comes in because video games seem to be kind of a testing ground for the ways billionaires can exploit people, new and exciting ones.
Oh, I I so much wish that wasn't the case, but yeah, pretty much ever since video games proved themselves to be a profitable industry, well, corporations got their hands on it, and then everything went to hell in a handbasket.
Well, there's always been some degree of monetization that wasn't necessary, like having Pokemon split across two games. But it seems like since the advent of downloadable content, where there's no longer even a physical component to it, they've just been finding more and more ways to extract until we've gotten to the point of NFTs, which are literally nothing for money.
No, that's the worst part. Actually, DLC started as a good idea. You know, before video games were sold in a digital in a download format. Well, you had two, three, four, five, or more physical editions of the same game just because the developer added whatever thing. Starting well with say 4 new fighters in Street Fighter 2, a new racing car, a new whatever. Originally, you sold the game all over again. It was more expensive to produce, and well, gamers had to buy the whole thing all over again. So DLC was originally a very good idea. Well, developers had this new thing they want to implement. Well, they just tell you this new thing specifically. And well, it could have been great if only it hadn't been introduced by Microsoft.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so one advantage of your comic is that you have it usually phrased like a newscast with your reporter Jezebel Phoenix delivering your take on the latest terrible news from either games or world politics. Does that how long does it take you to produce with that?
Well, the part that takes the longest in producing a weekly comic, I'd say, is the punchline. Is that
Yeah.
because, well, I may have the note, but if the punchline doesn't come to me, nothing comes out.
Well, you have some really great punchlines, like one about how Konami's not attending E3, neither is Kellogg's. It's like Kellogg's isn't a gaming company, neither is Konami. That was my favorite.
Thank you, thank you.
And you've also, since you mentioned tabletop gaming and you've written a lot of essays about it on your blog as well, how does that influence the way you approach understanding other mediums like video games and comics and so forth?
Well, different medias have different narratives. This is something, there's something that everyone had to learn in their own time. Well, video games originally had no narratives. The only story happening you learn about in the instructions manual. Eventually, very tiny slivers of story seeped into cutscenes and things like that. It wasn't until, no, not even PS1. No, I'd say until Xbox One that video games started resembling movies.
I forgive me, but it was at PS1 because that was where the original Metal Gear Solid was.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. Metal Gear Solid. Yes, that one was one of the first precedents for video games resembling movies.
Yeah. And
And
go on.
sorry. Well, and then tabletop role-playing games. They, I'd say they took a while into learning that, but actually, I'd say the jury's still out on that. I'm not sure we have all agreed on how a tabletop narrative has to be. Well, because, well, if we go to source material, we go to novels. However, in novels, the author is the sole owner of the whole thing. The author owns the story, the author owns the character, the author writes the story, the author says when this character lives, when this character dies, when this thing happens. However, in tabletop games, we have not one sole owner, but each player is the owner of their character, and they're also there. Basically, you have 5 authors or more in the same story.
Yeah, and I know that tabletop gaming has surged in popularity with the advent of things like Critical Role, which have like celebrities and professional actors streaming their games. Has that kind of shifted the way players approach it as a desire to like have some kind of role playing to it beyond just being so-called murder hobos who just want to kill and grind for XP?
Well, I'd say the first antecedent to actually trying to introduce narrative in tabletop games it started with this anime series called Record of the Lost War.
Huh.
The thing that was back then so novel about it was that the whole gaming table was comprised of writers. It
Huh.
wasn't just a game master. Every single player at the table was a writer. So they all did what they felt was best for the story at the time. And well, the that was the best and the worst of it because, well, basically Record of the Lost War was, mm, how like how do I call it? Well, I'd say the magnum opus of this person, Yuki Tokishiro.
Yeah.
However, I don't know a lot of his work, and sadly, he may have been a flash in the pan because I have heard of latter works from him, and sadly, they're not half as good. I mean, and then after Record of the Lost War came Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, and everyone went gaga over Dungeons and Dragons, especially since back then that was World of Warcraft's boom.
Yeah. So have you played several of the online MMO games as
Oh yeah.
well? Uh, And there, the equivalent of the game master is the system, what the server you're playing on. And do you find it worth role playing there, or do you prefer to just play it like a regular game?
Well, the first two antecedents of MMOs, well, there were Ultima Online and there was the Winter Nights. Alas, regarding a MMO that was the closest to a tabletop experience, no game has come close to Neverwinter Nights ever since. Because well, that game has that thing called the Aurora engine, where you as a game master could were able to program the whole thing. You program the encounters, what spawned where. You even had the options of including new 3D models, new music, and even had the options of intervening halfway through the play experience as a game master. And okay, I want a new monster to appear here because this player did this thing and this NPC is happy.
That, but actually putting in the effort to customize every aspect of the experience sounds like a tremendous amount of time, right?
Oh yeah, that was a huge time sink. And well, if you want to be a game master, you had to learn to program in the Aurora engine.
Yeah.
So if you didn't know how to code, well, you the experiences you could bring to your players were severely limited.
Yeah. So then it sounds like it, with video games especially, you can see how the time and labor needed to make these games keeps increasing as the sophistication of games technology increases. And that's been the result of a lot of these monetizing practices creeping in, right?
That and a lot of lies.
Well, yeah.
because well, because we know how expensive Mass Effect was to produce. But then Electronic Arts came with this rhetoric like, "Oh no, I'm a poor game developer that takes $100 million to produce a video game." Lies. No, really. I know from insiders in Electronic Arts that actually, well, okay. Today I may be a bit more, but about 10 years ago, back when I knew people in Electronic Arts, producing a summer blockbuster video game took only $10 million.
So a lot of the expense is just to ensure profit.
Merchandising, mostly. Marketing.
Yeah. And it does, I think Electronic Arts, they initially implemented microtransactions in a console game, with Dead Space 3 having loot box mechanics. And now that seems to be standard across all big AAA video games. And even though it was laughed at the time and Dead Space 3 didn't make it meet expectations, people eventually just went with it.
Yeah, the saddest part is that everyone went with it. No one but an eye. Europe is still fighting that policy. They are still accusing microtransactions of gambling, which it is what it is.
Yeah.
However, in America, I seriously doubt they're ever going to take it as gambling, mainly because well, that America is where most of the AAA industry is, and if the Supreme Court ever grows a spine, well, the industry will just threaten with moving to China or some other country.
Right. So you're coming from Mexico with your perspective. How have they responded to these kinds of issues? Have they? Or
Uh, well, well, in Mexico, they for decades they have been trying to indoctrinate us with this slogan of "say no to piracy." However, any power user, instead twisted into say, sure, why not to piracy? So, well, most users just bypass the whole experience.
Yeah.
A lot of people still resort to piracy. Some people do pay for microtransactions, and some people even defend it. However, uh, lost cases.
Yeah. And with piracy, obviously there's a moral gray area, but also the money you're stealing from is less would far less likely go to the actual people making the game, the developers, the testers, than it would to the companies, right?
Yeah, that's a very complicated issue. I mean, if you can buy the original product, buy it. However, there's no arguing that a lot of software is way overpriced, starting with $70 video games, and
Right.
then following with Photoshop, a reason why I moved to Clip Studio Paint years ago.
Ah, so that's why. Well, I use Clip Studio Paint for my comics. It is a very good program for creating art.
Oh yeah, and it costs about a tenth of the price of Photoshop, if not less.
That is also an important consideration. But as we've seen, just today I found out that with Amazon having bought the digital platform for comics, Comixology, they're just folding the whole thing into Kindle, and a lot of comics in a lot of countries that host it are getting shafted and aren't getting the benefits. So there's always the worry about that.
Wait, okay. I didn't know that Amazon bought Comixology.
Yeah, it was a while ago, and but now people are getting notices like your subscriptions in this country are no longer valued. We're sorry for the inconvenience. Maybe there's a gift card or something, but not always as an apology.
My God.
Yeah. So in one of your strips, you have the characters point out that fiction is different from reality because fiction has to make sense. And a lot of this stuff is so ridiculous, even beyond the confines of satire. Does that make it hard to write punchlines?
Harder by the year.
Yeah.
I really, really missed back when we didn't live in the mirror universe.
Yeah. And speaking, one thing that's a concern, not that this is not something that I'm holding you accountable, but you do make a lot of criticism of Xi Jinping and China for their very authoritarian practices. And on the one hand, it's true, he's terrible, and there are a lot of terrible things being done by China. On the other hand, there's a tendency online for a lot of it to get mixed up with yellow peril tropes and fear of Asian people in general, even those not Chinese. Do you worry about that messaging?
Yeah, that's a very very dangerous line. Yes,
Yeah,
how yes, unfortunately, yes, yes. Okay, well, I I yes, I won't sugarcoat it. I'm opposed to China in everything regarding their country's politics. However, yes, I won't deny that I may that I may have contributed unwittingly to yellow peril, especially the latest 2 years. Because sure, criticize China for years, for over 5 years, but then we get in the middle of the apocalypse. The apocalypse that, well, I won't say China caused. We have really have no idea. We weren't there. We don't have the whole story.
No.
And the thing is, not only in North America but in several countries, all the Chinese population is taking the hit,
Yeah.
and that is horrible. And then we're back in the 1940s talking about concentration camps and and I really
Yeah.
I-
I mean, it it's definitely incredibly difficult to say anything and not have it get distorted by the hall of mirrors that is internet discourse. Like, like there are a lot of leftists who are very unironically pro-China because of its affiliation with communism, despite in practice being another empire.
yeah, actually, I'd call China a case of state capitalism.
Yeah, that seems a lot more accurate. And it, especially when it seems like their entry in the video game industry came at a time when monetization was at an all-time high, and they, similar to Microsoft in the States, just kind of bought their way in.
Oh yeah, and loot boxes were actually a perfect storm because well they were pushed by China, but then they were amplified by Japan because well in Japan they have this long tradition of gambling. They love their pachinkos and so on. And well, back then we were all still very much in love with Japan, so it was all the easier to push the lock boxes onto us.
Yeah. And when talking about politics, since we come from different countries and have different backgrounds in this, but a lot of discourse seems to generally assume that the view of the majority nationality, like through an American lens. Is there any kind of misconception that you would want to be cleared up about how people see like Mexico and Mexican politics?
Well, if you have been alive during Donald Trump's era, you know everything there is to know about Mexican politics.
Uh,
No, seriously, Donald Trump copied bit page by page every single thing of the Mexican politics book.
yeah, your current guy, you compare him to Trump a lot, which is probably the least favorable comparison you could possibly make, short of the big H.
Oh yeah, now we're pretty much being punished by karma for laughing at Trump for 4 years. Now we're having our own Donald Trump.
My condolences.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's definitely dark times, but are there any like spots of hope within your country, like any kind of party opposing regressive policies that has the strength to push back?
Alas, much like in America, we have to choose between the devil we know and the devil we don't. Because, well, the most powerful opponent of our new default political party are, well, basically are this basically the religious right.
Right.
So yeah, okay, it's great that someone is opposing a dictator, but they didn't have to be these guys.
Yeah, I try very hard to keep a sense of hope on this podcast, and I'll admit it's difficult at times. one thing within the states that's encouraging is the amount of renewed union activity and the massive strikes going on. Do you see anything like that in Mexico happening, or?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Well, there's a lot of workers strikes in America now, and activity with building unions and building a kind of class solidarity against the ultra rich. Is anything like that happening in Mexico?
Uh, we're trying that, but we're about 2 years behind you guys.
Okay.
Unions are, I've heard of unions trying to form. Right now, they're being horribly squashed. But
Yeah.
I want to believe people will keep fighting.
Yeah. Well, if as things get more desperate, they'll have less and less of a choice than to keep fighting. And well, here's hoping. In lighter news, one question I had, since games people play is structured a lot like a joke a day strip where each strip is self-contained, have you ever thought of doing like a longer project?
Mm, Well, there are a couple projects I'd love to do as well. Mm,
I know that time is always a factor.
Yeah, there's only so many hours in the day. Also, okay. I was going to come with a crush that I'm far from having the level of expertise I'd want to start any of such project. We would come from webcomics, and we both know that the only way to start a project is starting it.
Yeah.
because you will never be at the skill level you want.
No.
So if that's your skill, you'll never start.
Yeah, you have to be willing to not like what you produce. But I think you definitely have the know-how to put together a decent comic. You definitely know how to set a stage and to draw convincing, expressive figures. So if you ever get back to it, I'll be the first in your corner.
Thank you.
And to leave off on another happier note, have there been any games you've recently really enjoyed? Anything coming out of the current state of affairs that's good, actually?
Well, video games actually, video games wise, last year actually was a pretty great year for video gaming. We had games like, mostly on the indie side.
But we
We
also
had
had Metroid Dread. That was really great.
Oh yeah, and Metroid Dread. That was amazing.
Yeah. There were definitely a lot of good indie games. There still are. And I don't want to give the impression that when I talk about the big things that good games are impossible or even that they can't come from the big companies, just that the conditions should be better for a lot of reasons, mainly so that people are treated better, but also so that we get better games.
Oh yeah, and going back to movies and their ties to the gaming industry. Well, as of late, Hollywood has been relearning the advantages of looking back to author films. We saw it with Deadpool, we saw it with Old Man Logan,
Yeah.
fortunately, the gaming industry has been taking heed, and we have been seeing pretty great things, even from Electronic Arts like Jedi Fallen Order.
Ah, cool.
Another great game which shows that Electronic Arts can still do great games when they want to do.
Yeah. Well, here's hoping to better times all around. Thank you so much for coming on. This Israel. You can check out his comic at games people play in the links below. Thank you again for going on.
Thank you for having me.